Days ago, California lawmakers passed a bill, AB 5. It would force more companies to treat more workers as employees, not contractors. So what's the big deal? Well, the gig economy. Whether it's Uber and Lyft or Postmates and DoorDash or TaskRabbit and Instacart, a slew of companies have grown up in the smartphone era with this radical idea. When just about everyone has a smartphone and a credit card, you can assemble a workforce in a moment's notice, pay workers electronically, and let them be independent contractors, not necessarily employees. They can work as much or as little as they want. But just because employers can do this doesn't mean they should, and that's what we're going to debate today. Welcome to Fort Knox, Rich Ideas and Powerful People. I'm John Fort from CNBC here at the NASDAQ market site overlooking Times Square. With me this week, two professionals who have driven for Uber and Lyft and have different opinions about just what should happen here. Kareem Bayoumi is out of L.A. He says drivers like him, he's driven 5 to 6 days a week for the platforms, deserve the protections of employee status and that the companies can't be trusted to provide that without a law. Harry Campbell is a former part-time Uber and Lyft driver who's now known as the rideshare guy. He's got a blog that focuses on the driver community, a YouTube channel, a couple of podcasts. He says forcing companies to treat drivers as employees is the wrong way to go. Great to have both of you. I want to dive right in. Kareem, first of all, bring me up to speed. How did you start driving? How often have you been driving? What's your situation right now?
Well, I've been driving for about 4 years now. I started driving because I was transitioning between work and I was starting a new family, and I was actually looking forward to having the flexibility of being able to work and spend as much time as possible with my family. And shortly after, I was expecting a new baby, and I needed even more flexibility and more time to be able to spend with the family. So that was originally why I started driving and how I got into driving.
So, I mean, if you're driving 5 to 6 days a week, I mean, maybe that's flexibility based on hours. It sounds like you're driving a lot. Did it work out the way you planned?
You know, honestly, in the beginning, it wasn't as bad as it is right now. The driving experience has been getting worse and worse over the past 4 years. I would say the flexibility is not much of a flexibility now, being that myself and other drivers are driving about 40, 50, 60, some are even driving 70 hours a week, which when you're putting that many hours, you don't really have much flexibility. I mean, you may decide when you want to drive 10 or 12 hours a day or when you want to take a day off, but you're still, you know, putting in a lot of hours, and it's not really much of a flexibility issue now.
All right, Harry, you drove part-time for about a year, am I right?
Yes, that's right.
And your circumstances were different. Tell me about when you started driving, what you were transitioning out of, and how you're a part of this sort of driver economy now.
Sure, yeah. So basically, I started driving for Uber and Lyft about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was in a part-time fashion. And, 4 or 5 years is a long time in rideshare years. Most people don't make it that long. But pretty quickly, I sort of realized that a lot of what Kareem was saying, drivers, it's not as easy as it may look on the surface, and there's definitely some issues and challenges. And so I started writing about that on my blog, The Rideshare Guy, sort of what it was like to be a driver and how you could make more money and strategies and tips, and really just kind of covering the industry. So for the past 4 years, I've been doing that full time on the blog, and we've got a couple podcasts and a YouTube channel, but it's all around sort of educating drivers and really helping them maximize their time and their money on the road.
Harry, it seems to me there's a clear difference here between whether you're driving as a side hustle versus trying to make this a full-time job. I mean, am I right? You're studying this, you're in touch with a bunch of drivers, you're making these resources. Is there a clear distinction here between how this works for you depending on how much you're trying to make?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think that, people often ask me, what is the typical Uber or Lyft driver look like? And I don't really have a good answer for them because there is a lot of variability, and they do come from all walks of life. But one thing we have seen is that between part-time and full-time drivers, they definitely value different things. I think a lot of the items that Kareem mentioned are definitely valid. And frankly, someone who is working 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, the job does become a lot tougher. You do have a lot less flexibility than someone who's doing it 10 or 20 hours a week, maybe gets health care from somewhere else, gets their insurance from somewhere else, and, has these other benefits. So I think that that's where some of the, you might want to call it the lines have been drawn, but But at the end of the day, I do think that there is more that part-time and full-time drivers have in common than you might think.
All right, now Kareem, my impression is that Uber and Lyft are really trying to get more drivers to do what it is that you've been trying to do, that they have these incentives to get people to drive longer, to get people to drive more often. I hear complaints from them about how often drivers turn over and leave the platform. They'd like people to stay. So tell me your perspective on how much they're trying to get people to drive and whether that lines up with their desire not to have the drivers be employees.
Well, I mean, right now, the system is definitely designed to keep you on the road for as long as possible. Even sometimes people would say that, as they're, looking to log off or go home, they would end up getting a long trip or a long request, or they're always kind of being fed a little something to stay on the platform longer. Now, the reason there's a high turnover right now, especially right now, is because the pay is so bad, and a lot of people will try this out and see that it's not worth it, and that they're pretty much driving for pennies right now, and they will decide, this is not worth my time, I don't want to do this, and they stop doing it. I mean, some will last a week, 2 weeks, a month. It depends on their situation.
So tell me,
right now,
how should this work, though? How should it work? Because it's your car, right? You're paying for gas, you're paying tolls, you're paying maintenance. If you were an employee, what's the right kind of deal that these companies should be giving you?
Well, you should be reimbursed for your time, the cost, and the expenses that you're paying to operate this business. Because right now, I mean, if you think about the pay right now, it doesn't even add up to your time and your labor plus your expenses. And for Uber and Lyft, right now it's not costing them anything to have a driver sitting in his car online waiting to take a call at any given moment, which is not fair for the drivers because you're investing your time, you're out somewhere. I mean, I'm pretty sure every driver could think of something better to do than to sit outside on the street at like 3, 4 a.m. waiting for a call. I mean, there's so many other things that are more beneficial and more rewarding than that. But because it's not costing Uber and Lyft anything for that driver to sit there and wait for that call, sure, why not? And that's why they keep adding more and more drivers every day. It's not costing them anything extra unless they're doing some work, which is not fair to the drivers. So that's why there has to be a cap, and drivers have to be compensated for their time and their expenses on top of that. And that way you're still going to have drivers on the road available to do the work that needs to be done whenever it needs to be done. Mm-hmm. And, there's going to be more opportunities for the drivers that are there doing this full time.
Harry, sounds reasonable to me. What's the matter with that?
Yeah, no, I think that exactly what Kareem is describing is what a lot of drivers care about. I mean, a lot of drivers, their number one reason for doing this is to make money. And, they want to go out there. And I think the number one complaint, too, from driving for both Uber and Lyft is that they don't make enough money. I think right behind that, in a close second, though, is the flexibility. And I think that's where you start to see that for the drivers who are doing it full time, they just value, after the pay, they value benefits, they value unemployment, they value disability insurance differently than someone who's doing it part-time. And I think when you look at the numbers, that's sort of where it gets a little tricky because a majority of drivers are out there. They are doing 10 or 20 hours a week or less. And even though they may not be the most important drivers to Uber and Lyft, I think it is just understanding that in a full employee model, there's definitely going to be winners and losers. And I think that, it's fair to say that the ones doing 40, 50, 60 hours a week are probably going to be the winners. And the ones that are, more part-time, there's potential that they could, be the losers. And so I think just...
But what Kareem is saying, it sounds like, is that it's the other way around right now, where the people who are driving the most are getting the worst deal, right? Which isn't, yeah. I mean, it's not the way that ideally, if you're the company, you would want this to work. So should there be a two-tier system where, hey, if you're willing to put in the hours, if you're willing to put in the time, if you're willing to drive in maybe higher demand areas where the companies know that they can probably get rides during a set block of time, you're an employee and you get the benefits that go along with that, but you don't get the flexibility to decide when you're going to work. You work when they say they need you. And then if you're one of those part-time workers, you take what's left over and, you check your phone, and when there's a ride that shows up that the full-timers can't take, you're on it.
Yeah, and I think that's, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, and I think that's sort of what you're describing is kind of exactly what I push for. I mean, there are a number of businesses out there that already use a mix of employees and contractors, and I think drivers like Kareem should have, more rights, and they should have better pay and, more, I guess you would say, consistency with their schedule and their earnings, because they are putting in so much more time than someone like me who might go in there, take a week off, go in there occasionally. And I think that, that kind of understanding that balance right now for the drivers who are, whether you're full-time or part-time, you don't have the ability to set your own rates like a true independent contractor might. You don't have a lot of say in who you get to pick up or where they're going, or really any say in anything like that.
Now, Kareem, a lot of people might not get this because unemployment is as low as it's been in kind of the modern era. The job market's supposed to be so tight. The way you describe the situation, trying to drive for Uber and Lyft full-time or more than full-time, sounds so bad. Why are people still doing it? What keeps you doing that versus something else?
Well, for a lot of people, I think mostly people that have been doing this for a while, they have experienced some good days, and they've seen that good days can pay off. Nowadays, there's not that many good days, but you're always kind of chasing that ideal perfect day where you get that really good ride, you make good money, and you go home a little bit early. There's always something, you had a good experience in the past, and you're always thinking that could happen again. You may have to go through 5 or 6 bad days to get another one good day, but it's almost like that carrot that you're continuously chasing. So I think for the most part, it's drivers that have had good experiences in the past that are still hopeful that they may have that again, and they're looking forward to that one more good day. I mean, for other people, they have their own reasons, whether it's, they're on disability, they don't want to have a regular job. There's different situations, and people have different issues that, they want to keep this job and it's working out for them. Even if it's not the best fit or it's not the most rewarding right now, but there's going to be some kind of reason that it's working out for them.
Now, I have just heard that California Governor Gavin Newsom has signed AB 5 into law. Uber and Lyft have both, as well as other companies, have been trying to push for exemptions here. This affects not just ride-hailing, ride-sharing companies, also Postmates, DoorDash, companies that are trying to do food delivery. Harry, the companies have tried to put forth a deal, a bargain, to not be specifically forced under AB 5, at least as far as the way legislators intend it, to classify these part-time employees as full-time. But do you think that's going to work based on what you're seeing in the driver community, that portion of it that does value the protections over the flexibility?
Yeah, I think one of the sort of interesting things I've noticed even from talking to the drivers who are scared about AB 5 passing and drivers becoming employees and then potentially losing flexibility is that a lot of drivers, whether they've been sort of for or against AB 5 in the past, don't really trust Uber and Lyft. They don't feel, it's ironic that Uber always calls their drivers driver partners, but a lot of drivers, really don't feel that it's a partnership. And so I think that those drivers who kind of are in that position are, even though they're worried about AB 5 passing, they're not necessarily on Uber and Lyft's side either. So I think that these arguments that the companies are now bringing out, I don't think that they hold a lot of water, but I do think that they are so determined not to let this happen. We're in for a pretty big and long legal battle, and one of the worries that I have is that drivers could basically get nothing for, maybe years at a time out of this whole situation if it just goes to the courts indefinitely.
Kareem, Uber made an argument days ago, or at least sort of telegraphed an argument, said the argument could be made that actually the drivers and what they do is not central to Uber's business. After all, they're more of a dispatch platform that can be used for lots of different purposes versus specifically, driving a person from A to B. What did you think of that?
I honestly think that's the funniest argument possible you could put out there. I mean, I totally agree with Harry that, drivers have absolutely no trust in Uber and Lyft, and that is because the lies they consistently try to feed to them. They will do one thing and try to convince you that they're looking out for your interests when it's, it's obvious what their intentions are. Uber has become a verb now. When somebody says, I'm going to take an Uber or I'm Ubering to this place, it does not mean I'm calling a platform, it means you're in a car, you're getting a ride somewhere.
Yeah.
And that, it's a common understanding now. I mean, I think a 3-year-old can tell the difference between an Uber and like a dispatch platform. It's pretty obvious what they're doing here.
Now, Kareem, I completely hear what you're saying. As a matter of fact, I said almost that exact same thing on CNBC last week when we first heard this from Uber. But then at the same time, I saw this note from RBC. They've got analysts who follow Uber and Lyft, and they did a survey. And according to this survey, the way drivers feel about Uber and Lyft, whether they're very satisfied or extremely satisfied with the platform, it was at 69 and 70%, which it's a little bit apples and oranges, but it's comparable to how consumers feel about Netflix. I don't get that. Doesn't line up. I feel like if we're talking to people who subscribe to Netflix, they're not saying Netflix doesn't care about me. They're saying I love Stranger Things. What did the survey get it wrong somehow, you think, or is there something behind these numbers that I'm not getting?
I'm sorry, was this survey for drivers or for consumers?
Yeah, it was a driver survey. More than 500 drivers in North America, in the U.S. specifically, they said. And that high percentage, 69 and 70%, said that they were highly satisfied with their experience on Uber and Lyft.
I personally know a lot of drivers, and I talk to many, many drivers on a daily basis. And this survey cannot be accurate. The only reason I could think of, and this is kind of a little bit of a common thing, is that some drivers are actually scared to express their true feelings when it comes to these surveys that Uber run on the app on a regular basis. And they're kind of a little bit scared that, they might say something bad about Uber and Uber would deactivate them. So that's one of the things that, that I could think of how a result like this will come out, because I'm pretty sure a bigger part of the result would be dissatisfied or people that didn't even take the survey.
Harry, what about it? Is it possible that a lot of the people who took the survey, and the numbers did show this, haven't been on the platform very long? Or maybe they are, part-timers who have another full-time gig or doing this as a side hustle, and it's doing what they need it to do. But maybe that 30% that isn't highly satisfied, those are the people who are really trying to make money at this platform. What are you finding? Because you're like the central guy in the driver community putting out information. If everybody hated it, nobody would be listening to you, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, I definitely have to dig into the methodology on that survey, because we run an annual survey of over 1,000 drivers every single year. And I think that, I could double check the numbers, but we typically find almost the reverse. I would have to say that more drivers are dissatisfied. But I could double check on that. I mean, I think you're definitely onto something there, though, John, with the fact that, what I call it in my book, I refer to it as a honeymoon period. When people are getting signed up to drive with Uber and Lyft, they're getting paid, they're having fun, they're talking to people. The first 3 months are kind of fun, and so definitely it matters when you are talking to drivers and the types of drivers you're talking to, whether they're part-time versus full-time, because I think as these things start to add up, as you start to put a lot of miles on your car, as you start to get, maybe have a negative experience here with their customer support, or have to go into one of their support hubs and talk to one of their agents to resolve, a false claim of, deactivation or something like that, you start to realize that there are definitely some downsides. And that's one of the issues that Uber and Lyft have right now. Last year we saw a stat that over 2/3 of their drivers are quitting after 6 months. So there definitely are some retention problems and some issues, and I think that's what's kind of spurring a lot of these discussions we're having right now.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I always wondered about that. It seems to me like at first, you get on the platform, it seems great. Every dollar you get seems to be profit to you, but then after a few times you got to fill up the tank. After it goes beyond oil changes, maybe you figure out wear and tear is costing you more on your car sooner than you expected. Suddenly that profit's getting erased later. Do people's feelings actually change? And so as you say more about that, tell me about these plans that Uber and Lyft, Uber in particular, trying to push around leasing cars
Yeah.
and renting cars and that allowing you to drive. Are long-term drivers even able to really, you think, take advantage of those programs and make money?
Yeah, and I think, John, this is where it gets honestly so complicated. It's funny because when you look at driving for Uber or Lyft, it seems so simple on the surface, but it can become pretty complex very quickly. And this is one thing we see, that there's just a lot of variability, not only on the income and earnings side, depending on where you drive and when you drive and how much you drive, but also on the expense side, right? Drivers are independent contractors for now, at least. That may change shortly, but so that means that they're also responsible for all of their expenses, gas, maintenance, even depreciation. And to figure out, how much your car is losing in depreciation for every mile that you drive is a pretty complex calculation. And frankly, most people and most drivers are not really qualified to make it. So it ends up that you have a lot of people, they come up with a $500 brake job that they weren't expecting and they don't have the money for it. So there's definitely some issues on the expense side and kind of really just understanding not only your profit and your loss. Uber and Lyft have come forth with a couple programs. Uber has partnered with a company called Fair here in Los Angeles that provides flexible weekly rentals to drivers, and the cost is $195 a week. One of the nice things about that is that it seems a little expensive at the start, but it actually includes unlimited mileage. You can return it at any time. So what I like about some of these programs is for the drivers who aren't maybe that savvy or who aren't thinking about their expenses and are putting 1,000 or 1,500 miles a week on their car driving, they at least know up front, okay, I made $800 this week, I spent $112 in gas, and I spent $195 on my rental. Here's exactly what my profits were, because for a lot of other drivers, it's just unknown, really.
Kareem, it seems to me like part of what Uber and Lyft are saying is that flexibility is important, the drivers are important to us, and we're not directing the drivers on exactly what they need to do and where they need to go. And yet, they've created these algorithms, and the algorithms tell you what you need to do, where you need to go, right, in order to make money. So is part of this just that the law has not kept up with the modern times? I mean, yes, technically maybe the employer isn't directing you, but the algorithm is. And so what does that actually mean, and how much is the government supposed to protect a worker when the algorithm's the boss?
Well, I mean, there should be some kind of labor standards in this country. I mean, we're living in a civilized country where there has been labor movements in the past, and people have fought for these labor rights and these movements, and we should uphold these. Now, whether the company tries to control you or not, I mean, if somebody tries to drive and they see what the incentives are and where they're pushing you, I mean, you're pretty much restricted to a certain area because this area is where you're going to get a bonus or where you're going to get an incentive. So, I mean, if you want to make money, that's where you want to drive. Otherwise, you're going to be missing out on all these chances if you're driving in a completely different area. I mean, they tell you what times these incentives are going to be.
Right.
I mean,
that's what I'm getting at. They're not saying, we're not saying you have to go there, but if you want to make any money, you'll be here at this particular time on this day.
Exactly. I mean, there's some kind of manipulation here. If you're out there to drive for money, if you're out there to drive for fun, you just want to get strangers in your car and take them wherever they want to go, and you're barely making your cost, then sure, go ahead. So, I mean, yeah, it's kind of funny. It's like, I'm not controlling you, but the system is controlling you. Well, who made the system?
That makes a lot of sense, Kareem. Harry, I'll give you the final word. How does this end up? The companies Uber and Lyft are not making money. They're not profitable now. Either they got to raise prices, which is going to affect demand, or I don't know. How is this going to work out? Is it going to work out so that they're making money and drivers are happier?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that what we're sort of starting to see is that Uber and Lyft are both definitely looking towards profitability. They're a ways away, and they may be, very well already increasing prices on riders. And I think that up until this point, riders have gotten a very good deal. They, haven't had to really pay the true cost of what it is to take a ride. Uber and Lyft, a lot of the early investors have made money, and I do think that the drivers have sort of gotten the short end of the stick. So ultimately, at the end of the day, with a legislation like AB5 that really puts pressure, whether all drivers end up becoming employees or not, or there's some type of compromise, I do think it is going to move things forward for drivers everywhere.
All right, that's a great place to leave it. Hey, a lot of great perspective that I hadn't heard before. Kareem, thank you. Harry, thank you. And that'll do it for Fort Knox this week. We'll see you next week.